Here we go.
Outrageous!
Hello, my name is John, and I love to talk movies, comics, anime, and I plan to have reviews and rankings, etc. out in the future. So if you're like me and enjoy those things, consider clicking that subscribe button. And today, we are returning to my James Bond journey, where I go through and watch all of the James Bond films, most for the first time, and share my thoughts. And today, we're talking about the fourth film, and that is 1965's Thunderball, directed by Terrence Young and starring Sean Connery. And now, up to this point, I've been mostly positive on these movies, but sadly, today is not one of those days, and Thunderball is not one of those movies, in my opinion. And I guess let's get started by talking about the action. The action in this movie is very ambitious. It's action that sounds good on paper, but not necessarily in execution, even though I do think they did their best at executing it. And the main reason for that is they're going for a lot of underwater action sequences. In a time before Aquaman, before you could do like CGI underwater sequences. And so you're actually filming people underwater, and I think for its time it's probably this great technological achievement, but naturally people move slower underwater, and it affects like people's coordination of the action sequences. And so both of those combined, they're fighting at a much slower pace, they're not as coordinated, and so it just feels slow and unexciting for those reasons. And particularly the underwater slaughter scene that I call it, which is basically the climax scene, it goes on for way too long, and it just feels like this mindless, underwater, slow-paced, uncoordinated scene. But most of that's only because of the fact that it's underwater. And so I do think that ambitiousness of going for all that underwater action sounds good on paper. I just don't think it's something that goes well in actual execution. But I do think there are a couple good scenes. You got the opening action scene, which is good. I feel like there's a couple of cuts that were kind of jarring, but for the most part, it's pretty exciting. And then the final fight on the boat, I really enjoyed, but it just felt like too little too late, as it was like the very, very end of the film. That being said, this movie did focus a lot more heavily on the spy elements than the action elements of the James Bond franchise. And so I'll kind of get into that a little bit later, but I don't think they executed it to the best of its ability. Moving on to the acting, I don't know if it was Sean Connery's performance. I doubt it, because he was good in the previous films, or his directing, which is another thing that was odd, because Terrence Young, I believe, directed the first two films as well. But James Bond felt like a jerk, especially during the first half of this film. When he's in the spa, he feels like a jerk, and then when he's being introduced, this is a scene that kind of bugged me a lot about his character in this film. When he's being introduced to the new gadgets, he kind of just feels like that jerk kid that just doesn't pay attention in like your high school classes, and he's annoying everybody. He just feels like one of those types of kids, and he just feels like a jerk basically for the first half of this film. And then Domino, the Bond girl in this film, she has a good story. She has good development and everything, but the actress just didn't sell me on her performance. And I guess that's pretty much all. I did like her development and story though, and characterization. And then moving on to the villains, Largo was just very uninteresting, very forgettable. Performance forgettable as well. But Fiona, I thought was a good performance, and I liked the characterization of Fiona. But she felt very unnecessary, and I think because of how good the characterization was, particularly the way she kind of snaps at James Bond in like the hotel scene in a way that you don't see very much in at least so far, from a woman character in this franchise. She just felt very wasted because she didn't add anything to the plot. All of her elements just felt very unnecessary. And if you take her out, it doesn't change the plot at all. And so there's that. And then the side characters like Paula and Pinder, I wish they would have utilized them better, because I did like the characters for the very, very small amount that they were on screen. So I just thought that was worth a mention. Moving on to the visuals. I do think this is probably the brightest aspect of the film, but that being said, I don't think it's as good as like Dr. No or Goldfinger. Production design, though, is stellar, along with stellar camera work, particularly when you're introduced to the Spectre conference room and then the conference room that they give James Bond's the mission debriefing in. That was all pretty good, as well as I liked the underwater room where they kept the nukes. I thought, like, when the door opened, I thought that was all pretty cool. And then the special effects, for their time, they were fine, but I don't think they've aged particularly well. But I'm not necessarily a guy that takes off too many points for aging purposes, as long as it holds up to its time period, and I think this one does. Moving on to the story. First thing is, the plot took too long to actually start, because you have all this stuff with this happening in the spa that I do think needs to happen to add build up to the main plot, but they took way too long and you could have cut it down quite a bit. And so I just think that, and then once they actually get going with the plot, they add like a couple side stories in it, like Fiona's character, which I talked about, but also having Paula's character being kidnapped and then having the failed rescue mission. Even though I did enjoy the character when she was on screen, they didn't have any development between her and Bond for you to actually care about the character. And so you don't feel anything when they fail to rescue her or when she gets kidnapped. And it just feels like a unnecessary plot line, side plot and scene to put in the movie. And so I think for the unnecessary side plots, along with it just taking too long to actually get the plot started, the story just feels unfocused. And in a movie, in a James Bond film that focuses a lot more heavily on the spy aspects than the action scenes, you need somewhat of a focused story to get the spy excitement, to get that spy thrills. And so you don't have that with this film, which adds to the fact that when you take away some of the action scenes and you don't pull off the spy aspects, it makes the pacing in this film in particular feels very, very sluggish. It was 2 hours and 10 minutes, but it felt like 3 hours. I was constantly checking how much time there was left. Talking about the sound, I don't think the sound is as good as the previous films. I do think it's the worst in that aspect as well, but I do think in terms of this film, it is one of the brighter aspects of it. But I also don't think they utilized the Bond theme as well as they should have. And then also in that underwater slaughter sequence at the climax, it was I thought the theme was good, but it's just very repetitive. They just kept like repeating the same couple notes over and over again. And they didn't do it in a way that was compelling like The Dark Knight does with its like one tone type of thing. It was just felt almost like over time it got monotonous, and so it just made that scene feel even more mindless and long. And so I do think overall the score is pretty good. And then the Thunderball song, it's not nearly as good as From Russia with Love or Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger, but I do think it's a decent song, but it's also a little forgettable. Moving on to the rating. It's an ambitious movie with ambitious action that sounds good on paper, but it isn't necessarily executed very well. And it does have some good moments in it, but they're few and far between. And it has a decent finale with the boat scene, but it feels too little too late. So overall, it's just a very uninteresting, forgettable, and honestly just a very boring film to watch with an unfocused plot and unnecessary characters and side plots. And so even though I've loved the film so far, it does pain me to have to give Thunderball a 2. Thanks for watching my video. As looking on the Rotten Tomatoes score, the IMDb score, and even the Letterboxd score, I'm sure there's a lot of people that disagree with me on this film. And so if you do, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so comment down below. And if you like this video, or even if you just liked me, consider hitting that thumbs up button, and also consider clicking that subscribe button if you enjoy movies, comics, and anime as I do. And as always, have a great day.